Okay, welcome everybody to this fifth installation of IHE related fire-related IHE profiles, a webinar series organized by HL7 Finland and open and freely accessible to everybody. And today's topic is, I guess, security audits and what was it? John, can you please introduce yourself and topic? Privacy concern, yeah.
All right, so let me get big on screen, of course. Let's try this again, that one. All right, so John Rookie with BioLite and co-chair of the IT infrastructure. And today I get to talk about two of my own profiles in the privacy and security space that I focus a lot of my attention on. First up is basic audit log patterns, and then second is privacy consent on FHIR. And there is, of course, some overlap that we'll get to in there. So basic audit log patterns, you can see the link to the profile there, the implementation guide. There we go. So the basic audit log patterns, or BALP, starts with the problem that today we have an audit trail and node authentication profile that speaks about secure communications and security audit logs, and that access controls are important functionally. And within that, that's a very open-ended thing. And what we realized is that given FHIR is predominantly being used in a RESTful model, we could define reusable audit log patterns for any RESTful opportunity. So whether you are doing a read on an observation or a read on an allergy intolerance, what should be logged into a audit log is the same. So what we wanted to do was create a pattern that dealt with REST, create, read, update, delete, and search, and dealt with any of the FHIR RESTful resources. Really, it can deal with any RESTful interaction. This would give some consistency just from the, what happened. But we also noticed, look, OAuth is used, whether it's Smart on FHIR or it's IHE's IUA or some other profile of OAuth. So let's give a pattern for how the audit log would indicate that this RESTful interaction was protected by this OAuth token. And then consistency to, well, when a patient's data are involved, how do you tag it such that a patient's accesses or the accesses to that patient's data are easily easily discovered, for example, in order to assist with creating a patient-focused report of how their data are used. So that was the problem that we were looking at within BALP. So as I indicated, we wanted to cover create, read, update, delete, and search. We wanted to have some consistency for OAuth. We also wanted to have some consistency for SAML, because SAML can be used with RESTful as well. And it was just rather easy to think through some of these patterns. Once we got that done, there were some other things that were discussed either here or there or elsewhere that also made sense to be consistent. When an authorization decision is made that's based on a consent, how do you indicate that this authorization based on a consent, what consent was it based on? There is a concept of an explicit disclosure, so you know that this isn't just a random, authorized RESTful interaction, but it's explicitly a disclosure outside of the scope of your security. So there's a pattern for that as well. So we looked at what are some of the patterns, and I've even recently found some more patterns that can be in a future rendition of this. So IGE, excuse me. So we usually have within any of the IGE profiles, implementation guides, a security consideration section. So let's just say the FUBAR profile has in volume 1 a security considerations that speaks to the use of audit logging. It has some transactions. In those transactions, there's security consideration sections that say when this transaction happens, this is how you'll log it if you're grouped with Aetna. So we already have this security consideration section. So we do have some precedent there. And what we wanted to be able to do was make it easier for those as well, so that they don't have to specify as much of the basics of, hey, this is a read transaction. Okay, we'll just say it's a bulk read transaction and just add your additional contextual pieces of information to it. Oh, this is a FUBAR profile transaction 1, 2, 3, 4 read. So you don't have to then have differences or a lot of profiling within that FUBAR implementation guide. That drives more consistency as well, because one of the things that we've noticed over the 20 years is that the table that we had been using when we just had core Aetna sometimes would drift. Someone would copy it from a different place and a mistake would enter, and someone else would copy that and another mistake would enter. With an implementation guide using structure definition profiles, we can drive some consistency across all of the sub uses of a audit event. So this is a content profile, we'll call it, based upon the IG Aetna. And specifically, if you notice on the footer there, it says RESTful supplement. There is a supplement that isn't final because, FHIR isn't normative yet for audit event. So it's a supplement. So we have Aetna, which is normative. It uses a DICOM schema, but we have FHIR RESTful flavor of that so that all of the FHIR audit event mechanisms can be used. And that's in a supplement. And in that supplement is also a query that uses FHIR audit event. So we already have an audit creator and an audit consumer as defined in Aetna, plus the RESTful supplement. So all we really needed to do was define the content that goes across those transactions, that ITI 20 and that ITI 81. Within here, we do get into some things which is rather typical with content profiles, in that you are defining contextual profiles, and from a consuming side, you're defining some specific ways to query and some specific use cases for query. So there is some profiling there, but it's predominantly around the content. So BULP is a content profile on the FHIR audit event in the context of Aetna. So The diagram here is kind of to try to introduce the Aetna actors in a way in which people might understand a little bit more when they come from the RESTful world. So in this case, we're talking two dominant actors here, any secure client and any secure server. And really that's intended to speak to any FHIR interaction, a client talking to a server, doing requests. So again, RESTful, but any client and any server. And then on the far right, you have the audit record repository. So that one is very specifically speaking to this profile. In all cases, all three of those actors are really just using FHIR. There's no additional non-FHIR stuff going on there. Now they could be doing something else since they're any secure client and any secure server, but effectively we're just using FHIR in this case. So the any secure client has been enhanced by saying, oh, it is supporting this BULP profile, and any secure server is also indicating it's supporting BULP. Therefore, transaction 3 happens in that the server will record that, hey, this client just requested this information. And the client, when it gets the information, it will record, hey, I successfully got this information. So there is a requirement in here, 3 and 5, that if you're supporting BULP and Aetna, you would send this audit record off to record repository. One of the things that many people get a little bit concerned with is, well, what if I need to be configured in a way that I'm not recording it at this time? That's not anything that the IHE profiles are going to say. The IHE profiles say you have to be able to send this audit event over there. We recognize, especially with audit events, once a system is up and going and everything is great, you might turn off the audit log sending. Now, the problem with turning it off is that, well, if something does go wrong, you don't have an audit log to look at, and you can never know when you need an audit log. But I just wanted to disconnect the requirement to have the ability to record the audit event from, in real time, in practical reality, always recording it. Those are two separate things. One is policy, always recording it, or okay, it's okay to turn it off for this month because we've gotten proof that we're working, whatever that policy is. You then see a table there, and this table comes right out of the spec. What I want to kind of explain with the table is how to read it. The rows are clearly the RESTful interactions: create, read, update, delete, and execute or search or query. There is the second column is the basic profile, and that is a profile where the object that you're interacting with has no patient data. So maybe it's a create of an organization resource, or a create of a provenance resource. So if the interaction is not patient specific, then you use that second column. If the interaction is an allergy intolerance or a condition or a vital sign, then clearly there's a patient involved. So the third column adds the requirements when the data are patient related. And then there's the last column has examples. And there's examples of both in here. So one of the things that people have confused, and I apologize, tables need to be somewhat succinct, and the with patient has been misinterpreted as meaning that the user is the patient. And with patient is actually when the subject is a patient. So that's the distinction between column 2 and column 3. So column 2 is about any resource that is not patient specific. Column 3 is any resource that is patient specific. And really all that 3 does is it adds the patient specifics in a consistent way so that you can say, hey, given this patient, what are all of the audit events related to this patient? So it enables that level of query. So then I talked about the fact that there's an OAuth token that may have authorized the FUBAR interaction, or maybe it's a SAML token that has authorized the FUBAR interaction. So it's important when you record, hey, this thing happened. It's important to record, and by the way, this is the reason why it was authorized to happen. Or this was rejected, and and this was the token that they gave me. Can't you see why I needed to reject it? So when a security token is used, how does that get recorded into the audit event so that you can see why something was authorized or why something was, rejected, really? And again, it's profiled generically for OAuth, so it should work with any OAuth environment. And it's written specifically, generically for SAML as well. We tried to limit the information that's recorded such that it is not really exposing the security itself, but exposing an identifier that if you have access to the token authority, you can find out the details of the token. But quite literally, sometimes, all you have is a token which is reusable. There has been some discussion that what we're putting into the audit log is reusable, replayable, if you will. And the answer there is either A, if that's your environment, then turn off recording of the security token, and you won't know why a query was authorized. Or B, recognize that the audit log itself is full of sensitive information. The audit log is, in some respects, the most sensitive area of all, which is why when the audit log accesses are done, you of course have to log the accesses to the audit log. So you can minimize it. We tried to minimize it. We've gotten some comments. There's some change proposals going through the system to adjust it a little bit here and there. One of the related things is there are some trace IDs that can be used instead of an OAuth token. So there's some change proposals going through right now to better leverage trace IDs. We do have in BULP a way to record an HTTP. There is an ID that's it's escaping me. I'm sorry. There's an ID at the HTTP level for session ID, something like that. We do have a profile for how that should go into an audit event. And if that's all you need and you don't need the OAuth as well, then you're good. So again, there is some improvements going on there, but we desperately need feedback when you see an opportunity to improve this. So this is an area that I stand and say, hey, if you think you can improve it, by all means, let us know. So The other kind of a group of things, so far we've kind of been rather core, rather security focused. But there's a privacy focus within BULP as well, in that if you have an audit log, this enables a privacy principle of transparency, meaning that a patient ought to be able to see how all their data are used. This is a transparency principle of privacy. So by having a strong pattern for how an audit event that's recording, something happened and it knows that this was patient specific, that means that we can now do queries that say, hey, given patient ID 1234, what are all the ways that patient's data are used? And there's a distinct query into the audit events for that. There's, as I indicated before, there's a specific pattern on audit event when an authorization decision is based on a consent. So how do you point at the consent, the specific consent instance that was used to authorize or to reject an access control request? And then when you know that you're disclosing information outside of your security and privacy scope, this is a privacy disclosure. Therefore, who did it, when did they do it, why did they do it, why, and to whom. So a privacy disclosure is a specific pattern as well within BULP. So currently we are reusing BULP within a bunch of other profiles like MHD and PDQ, PICS-M, PEMR, MCSD. The list is actually bigger than is shown here. What happens there is, so I'll just speak to MHD. So MHD has a set of transactions. Those transactions are, protectable by ATNA if you're grouped with ATNA. So within MHD, rather than define the whole audit event when a MHD search is done, we just say, oh, we're going to use the BULP search and we're going to identify it as an MHD, ITI, blah, 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 and we don't need to further enhance the profiling. So the amount of specialization within these is really to just specialize it to indicate the context which profile is being used at the time. Sometimes there's some other things that need to be done. So this is a way that IHE itself reuses BULP. And in this way, we then can leverage the profile validation through all. So that's all I had on BULP. Might be easiest to take some BULP specific questions now, but we can also take questions at the end. Here is a reminder of where BULP is, where IHE's IT infrastructure publications are, and that we do have an IHE stream on Zulip where we discuss these things.
Very cool. Thanks, John. There is a question in the chat from Kari. Is there a special spec for FHIR operation, dollar operation pattern audit logging? Or is this broken down to logging request and its parameters and then individual resources accessed/returned?
Yeah, when we wrote BULP, that was something we wanted to do. But we couldn't figure out a generic pattern for operations, since operations can do anything. So we don't have, the answer is we don't have it in there. What we have been doing is through our other profiles, like MHD does have 2 operations in it, is we've kind of started to work up that there are kinds of operations that can fall into some categories. Easiest is, when a operation is predominantly doing a create, well, then use the create profile. Or where an operation is predominantly doing updates. So if an operation is predominantly doing something, start with the pattern that is that RESTful interaction and add to it what's your operation that's being done, because that then distinguishes it from a generic RESTful interaction. And then, potentially you may need to decorate it a little bit. But for the most part, we've found that just taking the RESTful interaction that is most like, we end up with something. Now, we might find a better way to say that, but we really haven't yet found a better way to say that.
Great, thanks. I also have a question. I'm quite novice in this security space. I have been working a bit with Bulb and implemented that in some of my apps, but just for internal purposes. Can you tell a bit about all the tooling and existing solutions that are using that? So you referred, for instance, to the audit event repository. Is that usually just a fire server, or are there more sophisticated tools with dashboards and all kind of analysis tools and so
on? Yeah, actually, that the question helps me because I was realizing that I hadn't actually indicated something that I'm aware of. One, I have been told that the Firely server, Happy server, I really have this recorded somewhere. There's a bunch of the common fire servers that have implemented Bulb. It's not on by default because, of course, it would be very noisy, but they're implemented, so you just need to look into your tool to find out if, how to turn it on. You could use a generic fire server, but some of the policies around audit logs might encourage you to do something more specific. For example, audit logs, as we indicated, are very sensitive, sometimes more sensitive than the patient data themselves, because it includes security tokens that could potentially be reused for a lot worse. And then the other thing is, since audit logs are constantly being created, you need to have policies around how to purge them. How do you make sure that they have been recorded to some offline storage in case there's a need to get to them, or that you've confirmed that this information isn't needed. So a purge schedule is important to have. Some audit events are easier and can be purged sooner. Some audit events need to be hung on to for just about as long as any of the patient data themselves. So I am aware that some of the, again, platform vendors are looking at developing an audit log specific flavor of their server. I would expect that will come with tooling, as you suggest, but I don't know of one that has been announced yet. Again, I may not necessarily learn when they announce it, but I do know that like Health Samurai is looking to develop such a thing.
Yeah. When I was developing this feature, it was mainly for the transparency aspect. So in SensorTrend solution, the patient can give consent to a clinic or healthcare professional to look at their data, and then we record each successful retrieval, and then we realized, okay, we should also record their rejections. And okay, this clinic tried to access your data, but they didn't have a valid consent at the moment.
Exactly.
And I started by implementing that into the, let's say, patient-facing data store, so that when they get their data, they also get the audit events if they want to get all the raw data. But I noticed I was then playing around with Google Healthcare API, and they do have completely separate infrastructure for audit events. Didn't verify whether that was following any of the IHE profiles, but I would imagine so. So there's separate thing for that. And my main question was, is there some kind of tool that I would, for instance, that would help me track that, hey, now there's suspicious amount of these rejected queries. Why is somebody so desperately trying to access this data?
Yeah. I'm wondering if I put it onto here. No, I didn't put it onto there. I know I've been recording it somewhere. And I'll look that up and get it to you, because I've been rather excited that there has been implementations.
And
All right.
for the offline viewers watching this later, chase John in Zulip and ask for that information. All right.
All
Thanks
right.
for that.
So,
any other questions? No.
all right. Well, I think we better move on to PCF.
Yes.
This is actually a little bit deeper than the other one, but I'm going to end up going rather high level. So PCF is privacy consent on FHIR. So we're going to go through some of the foundations of privacy policy writing and some of the decisions you have to do while writing policies. This is an appendix in IHE because it's really not interoperability, it's foundations on which privacy is built. And it's actually the hardest part, is just getting your privacy policies written, especially in a way that is implementable. Oftentimes, they're written in ways that sound good to a human but have no ability to be implemented. So there's an Appendix P that goes through some of this stuff. Second is capturing the consent, otherwise known as, what's the output of the ceremony. So you put a consent in front of a patient, you interact with the patient. Maybe they give you some additional concerns or restrictions or maybe allowances. All of that ceremony needs to be captured in a consent. And PCF starts with the capturing of the consent. PCF does not have in it the everything up to that. It doesn't talk about interaction with the patient. It doesn't talk about using questionnaire. There are some efforts, especially within HL7, there's a FAST project that's looking at that side. How do we present a consent using a questionnaire, and how does the questionnaire result in a consent resource that meets the IHE PCF profile? Once you have a consent, there's 3 different patterns in here as well. And again, sorry for reusing the word pattern too much today, but essentially, within the consent world, there are some basic patterns. Consented, yes, no. There are some intermediate kinds of vectors that a patient might request that are easier to implement, so I call them intermediate. And then advanced is using security tags on data and somehow identifying all the data that is falls into a particular kind of sensitivity, which is also discussed in Appendix P. And then within PCF is a profiling around making an authorization decision that is based upon a consent, and then enforcing that authorization decision based on a patient consent. So those are the things we're going to be going through. So here's not an exhaustive list, but a set of relatively useful use cases. So a basic consent that says, yep, within this organization, I agree to that organization's privacy policy. Or where you have a centralized consent repository within some kind of a health information exchange that's authorizing the flow of data within that health information exchange. Consents authorizing a very specific data request. So examples might be where a particular individual or a particular access is not covered on something like treatment, but it's covered under some kind of a legal action, and the patient has agreed that that legal action is allowed. So there's a consent that's for a very specific data request. We have things like implied consent and explicit consent. We differentiate within there because even implied consent, someone can come along and explicitly dissent. So you have to be able to cover those kinds of things. Intermediate consent, as I said, these are kind of the easier ones, but this is like where the patient says, yes, I'm okay, except I do not want the data that you have that is authored in 2020, the whole year. I don't authorize that data. Or I'm okay, but by the way, there's a particular lab result that I don't want authorized. So data by identity. Or data by author. Hey, there's this particular doctor I go to for alcohol abuse treatment. Anything that doctor has authored, I don't want. Or an episode or an encounter. Or explicitly purpose of use. So these are some easier to implement vectors because they're just common elements in any data that is healthcare specific. They don't require you to add a data tagging service. The advanced consent is what many people think of when they think of sensitive topics. And this is like, well, okay, across all of your data, anything related to, a sexual abuse evidence. So it's up to some tagging service to find all of that data and tag it such that that data then can be restricted from access. And again, I'm speaking to restriction. All of these can be inverted. They can be the reasons why you are authorizing the data. So, for example, I'm seeing a specialist, and that specialist really only needs to see the information related to encounter 1, 2, 3, 4. So I'm authorizing the specialist to have access to any data related to encounter 1, 2, 3, 4. So all of these can be inverted as well. So in this case, I'm going to walk through kind of how the profile is organized. So we have volume 1 that defines the use case and the actors and how those interact through transactions or content. Volume 2, where some transactions are, and in this case, our transactions are pretty simple. Volume 3 is where, in this case, with the consent, there's this profiling of consent and also profiling of OAuth. So PCF is not just about profiling consent, it's also about profiling OAuth. And the profiling of OAuth is designed to be layered on top of your normal OAuth environment. So if you're using Smart on Fire, you layer these additional extensions onto Smart on Fire. If you're using IUA, you layer these on top of. So you'll see that when we get to it. And then volume 4 is national extensions. We don't really have any of those yet. So Appendix P, just to kind of give you a flavor for what's in here, because again, Appendix P is all about writing of privacy policies and some considerations when writing them. So this isn't interoperability, so to speak, but it's the kind of stuff you have to do in order to get interoperability. So right off the bat, we explain you have to have a policy for when there is no consent given by this patient. Maybe the patient has shown up in an emergent or a walk-in case. Maybe that patient is not at that moment able to give consent. What's your policy? PCF isn't going to tell you what your policy is. So again, this is things you have to think about when you're writing your policy. What do you do when, a consent is on file? Is there a mechanism available for the patient to change their mind? What happens when you have two different policy spaces or two different consent spaces, and there's conflicting information between the consent policies? So let's just say at the health information exchange level, the patient said, yes, everything's great. But within your clinic, the patient says no. Well, which one takes precedence? Again, one of them might take precedence, or you might just halt and ask the patient. That's up to you to discern. We talk about role-based access control versus attribute-based access control. Um, Really, a lot of this stuff has been improved over the years. We speak to break glass. Do you need a break glass? Many organizations don't need a break glass. But if you do have a break glass, who's authorized to break the glass? I doubt that you're going to allow, anybody off the street to break glass in this case. But again, what does that do? And then audit log policies. What do you record? How often do you review those? Do you support the patient coming to the privacy office and saying, hey, I think Dr. Bob has been looking at my data in a way in which it's, inappropriate? And then there's a section in there, I hinted at it, specifically around security labeling service of stigmatizing information. So some examples: alcohol abuse, drug abuse, mental health, sexual assault, HIV. These are just examples, right? And within there, there's some examples of some value sets. These are old value sets, but whether they're 9 years old or they're 9 minutes old, any value set that is saying, hey, these are all the mental health codes, it probably is a maintenance task in that, SNOMED and LOINC. These are evolving code systems at all times, and local codes need to be embedded in this and such. So we also speak about the fact that a one dimensional value set is not necessarily sufficient. Sometimes you have to, deal with combinatorics. For example, I've been told there's a couple of examples where a drug by itself is not at all an indication of a stigmatizing health topic. But boy, if you have this drug and this drug together, it's clear. Or these three together is, and that's just an example of some drugs. Um, again, this is not an easy space, but that's why, the security work group in HL7, where Rich and my co-chair, we just kind of said, you know what, there needs to be a security labeling service that is made aware of all of these things. So security labeling service is used with advanced. It's not really used with the others. It's just used with advanced. There's some discussion in there around some various architectures. Do you tag data on the way in? Do you tag data at night? Do you tag data when it's queried? Do you do all of the above? So when do you tag data? And do you remove tags? So a bunch of different questions. All right, so now I'm going to get more into the PCF use cases. So As I said, we profile the consent, primarily the capturing of the consent, support for updating, changing, removing, and then part two is around access control, which is mostly around profiling how OAuth would look given a specific consent. So here's the actor transaction diagram. The capturing of the consent ceremony is that little two things on the left. Um, all the rest is OAuth. The three big boxes are the common OAuth boxes, and you can see within there. In IHE's case, we used IUA. So you see IUA authorization client, authorization server, resource server. And then you see that it's been augmented in PCF with a consent authorization server, which is grouped with a IUA or an OAuth authorization server, and a consent enforcement point that is grouped with a resource server. And you'll see when we get to volume 3 why that's important. So capturing of the consent, I'm going to probably go really quick through this because it's just, RESTful consent and a set of profiles. So the profiles are the important part here, but they show up in the volume 3 anyways. So this is really just create, read, update, delete, and search. So it's just normal stuff. We don't really get into here. This is an interoperability spec, so we don't get into some architectural things about, well, is there one consent registry? Is there two? If there's two, how do you coordinate? We don't get into any of that. We just simply say that there is a consent registry. So there's a lot of work to be done on deployment, especially if you are in an environment that wants to federate consents, not centralize, but federate, or support consents that might come from somewhere else randomly. Those are some environmental or some implementation specifics that we don't necessarily get into. So volume 3 is really where the details are. As I indicated, broke down into explicit basic consent, explicit intermediate consent, explicit advanced consent, and obviously at the very beginning is just implied consent. So with implied consent, we defined 4 policies, and we defined them in generic terms. Obviously, they have to be, backed by some real policies, but essentially to show how, these kinds of consents can be built as building blocks. So how does a consent impact access control? Well, it augments, we were augmenting the OAuth flow. Like I said, predominantly this is your normal OAuth flow. We don't really need anything specific in the OAuth flow. What we do is we say, well, the authorization server needs to have the assistance of this consent authorization server such that it makes decisions that are informed by the FHIR consent or the set of FHIR consents that are available. That could be a go, no go, at which site there, the rest of OAuth is doesn't matter, right? So in the case where it's an outright reject, we're done, the token is not issued. In the case of, the patient said, no worries, everything's a good go, then it can also just be your normal OAuth flow. But at least then the decision is informed by the consent status. But we have this additional little implied dashed line between the consent enforcement point and the consent authorization point, because sometimes there's some residual yes, but, so to speak, that you have to send over to the server to further refine any data. that might be released. This is not intended to be something I'm going to go through in detail, just to kind of show you that we do have this level of detail in the profile, and it is going through all of the various interactions. So here is one example, and on the left is an excerpt of the consent. Now, it's not the whole consent, or you wouldn't be able to read it. It's just kind of an excerpt within there. It's actually just the provisions. In this case, the patient has agreed to treatment, payment, and healthcare operations, something we commonly call TPO. But there's a second provision here that says deny anything authored by this doctor, Dr. X practitioner. So what this is saying is we're going to allow any normal treatment interaction, but we're not going to allow any data that's been authored by this doctor. So imagine this is, the case where the doctor is a mental health practitioner, and the patient is just simply saying, hey, anything my mental health practitioner has ever written about me, I don't want shared, right? That makes sense. So obviously, when it comes to an access control decision, it can't be a yes, go ahead, give them everything. You have to somehow tell the enforcement point also that you're okay to do treatment, payment, and operations. So the normal TPO, the normal purpose of use stuff in IUA, this is the extension that's used. And then we have this additional IGPCF extension that carries with it specifically we are talking about this patient, and we are talking about this consent. So this is the identity of this consent over here. And then there is a residual requirement here to deny anything authored by this practitioner. And you'll notice this is a rather similar layout to what's over here in the consent. And indeed, it is a rather similar policy. So at the resource server, what would happen then in a resource server that is enforcing this, so it implements PCF enforcement, is it would say, okay, I'll let the query happen, but before I return results on the query, I'm going to look at all of the data that's in the bundle and remove anything that's been authored by this doctor. So, this would be probably implemented that way. Now, it could be implemented, differently depending on your architecture. That's why how you implement it is important. The interoperability is what's being specified. So you can see it's not that hard to say, yes, everything except for data that's authored by this particular doctor. For each consent pattern that we have examples, and we have examples of the OAuth for that example. So not only do we have profiles that cover many different things, but we have examples that cover each one of those, and those consent examples have OAuth fragments. And one of the interesting things is when I first presented this, I noticed I had made a mistake in the specification, and Sense has fixed that. So if you see mistakes, by all means, let me know. This one here, at least I had it originally problematic. So we have about 5 minutes. We could go into PCF and poke around if that works, but I'll take questions now while I go ahead and set that up. So questions?
Great stuff, John. I have one question, kind of my usual question. any known implementations, so like OAuth authorization server or mechanism that talks to a consent repository? Are you aware of any of those?
I want to say that I do know, but I don't. I don't know.
Right.
And
also not aware of whether this has been tried in Connectathons or.
I don't think this has been tested at Connectathon yet. So that I'm pretty sure has not happened, but that doesn't mean it hasn't been, implemented. But I don't think I've seen it at Connectathon testing. So here's that volume 3 where I said, the real meat is. And you can see under basic, there is, 4 different patterns. Under intermediate, there's all of these kinds of patterns. And then, I do go through this idea of where you do a search and then you remove elements from. So this is kind of an example what I was just showing. And then advanced deals with things, restricted data, mental health data, sexual health data. So again, in each one of these, we have examples of representative examples of that kind of advanced profile and what would be the impact on the access token in each case. And then this is an example where data tagging happens. And if you actually look in the graphics are not nearly as clear, but if you look, we do have data in here that has been tagged and the like. So I just kind of wanted to go through that. If there's any particular use case somebody wants to discuss, we can poke into one. Any other questions? Okay. Well, we are at the top of the hour.
We are. Thank you again, John. And for any audience, I'd like to highlight that yes, I kind of am looking forward to products actually conforming to these profiles, because when I was implementing all of this, I had the feeling that I'm doing essentially the same stuff as many others would be doing. Kind of was hoping that there would be a product that handles both the audit event and consent management for me.
Yep.
Thank you, John. One question that which is not related to this presentation, but it's security question. So can I send you email?
Of course.
And ask.
Yes.
Thanks.
Of course.
And we have one more session coming up this year. That's just before Christmas on December 19th, and that's on scheduling.
And I'm hoping that presentation gets put together by then.
We are also hoping.
Yeah, we're working on getting that published to trial implementation right now. Hopefully that'll be out in the next couple of weeks. As well as we're updating, we're integrating any change proposals from the last year. So
that's the reason why we are having that as the last session of this webinar series, and that's truly bleeding edge stuff then.
yes.
So see you then. Thanks, John. And thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you again.